This is going to be our introduction to fascia, the little bit of the structure, and then what that structure has to do with movement. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, so here we just call this moving fascia, and that's basically our thing. I'm going to move us on a little bit. And again, I'm happy to send this PowerPoint out to all of you. So one of the things that we usually start this with is just a movement sequence. And again, you can have access to this PowerPoint. But one of the things that's very important in any kind of fascia work and really in movement is fascia works better, and the lubrication quality of fascia, which we'll talk about later, works better when you're warmer. So if any of you have had that feeling, and I'm sure all of you have, of getting up on a cold day and like, ugh, like you feel like you need the oil can, that really literally is that the fluid within the fascia is thicker and denser when it's colder. And so really warming a body up before you do things is really important. And so this is just a simple, little wake up routine here. And as we said, the science is still evolving, right? We are providing what we can based on the information that's there. But there's a lot of things that are not known at the moment.
The science is evolving, and as always, it's following practice.
Yes.
You know, so much of what we're going to talk about, you guys see in practice all the time.
And you understand from an intuitive level. And a lot of what we're trying to do almost is, as often science does, is take observation and understanding and then figure out scientifically what's going on with that observation and understanding. So the legend of fascia. Up until really rather recently, I'd say the last 30 years or so, maybe even a little bit earlier or later than that, fascia was one of those things that was just considered the plastic bag around the goodies inside. So in dissection, they would just take off the fascia to get to the good bits. That was really how they thought about it. And osteopaths, a long time ago, a guy named Stihl, S-T-I-H-L, really started to recognize that the fascia played a much more significant role in the whole system of the body. But again, Western science didn't really take that on until, really the last 12 or 15 years strongly, and maybe the last 30 from the beginning.
Right. Western science really looked at muscles and joints, and their direct interconnections through ligaments, but didn't look at how these systems traversed each other through the fascial system.
And again, it's very easy to study something small.
Yeah.
It's much harder to study something big. And that's really where, where fascia has come through. So we're going to go here. So fascia is a key element of everything we do. I think that's clear. I don't need to say that any more clearly than that. So what is fascia? What is connective tissue? That's really what we're talking about here. So let me go to here. So fascia includes all of the different kinds of connective tissue that create and support the structure of the body. Now, what's interesting here is how different these different structures are. So bone is actually a connective tissue. And the reason for that is because it is the same matrix that we'll talk about, fibrous collagen matrix, but it's been calcified. And then we have ligaments, we have tendons, we have the muscle structure, endomysium, perimysium, and epimysium, all the parts that take those muscle fibers and organize them to act upon our joints. It also creates the structural support for the organs. And it connects.
And it connects. This is a common theme you're going to see with the human body. While the human body is incredibly complex, it comes up with an idea, and then it reproduces it in different places to achieve the result it needs. So for example, bones are hard, right? So it calcifies. But then we get to ligaments and tendons, and we're going to have different levels of elasticity. Well, guess what? It's the same basic structure, but it's going to have different levels of elastin versus the calcification, right? So you're going to start to see that the body has this beautiful way of taking something that works, replicating it to meet the function. It's really incredible. And that's kind of how I want you to start thinking. We really want you to start thinking about fascia. It's not any one thing, right? It's all of this rich connective tissue that has to meet the function at the moment. And so they're all going to have slightly different qualities.
So what is connective tissue? Connective tissue includes many different elements. It's not one thing, it's a lot of different things. And as Joy said, every kind of connective tissue has a different amount of collagen. So some are more stretchy, some are less stretchy, some are stiffer, some are looser. So lots of different ways that the fibers, which are essentially the key element of connective tissue, relate.
Right, how they organize themselves.
Yeah. So here, this little picture is just essentially, you can kind of see it on your screen. You've got a little capillaries at the bottom there. All those little blue threads are the collagen fibers. And that is really the key element of connective tissue, is that the collagen fibers run through really all the way from the bone through to the skin and help to support the whole system. Now within that, you've got collagen fibers, you've got elastic fibers, you've got reticular fibers, all of which have different qualities, and it is the proportions of those that will change the quality of the fascia. You've got fat cells, which can live in there. You've got a lot of the immune system. You'll see lymphocytes and macrophages in there. One of the interesting things that they're working on is the idea of how much they're calling it the interstitium in some way, but essentially there's kind of a fluid highway that runs between all of our, like let's say one muscle sitting on top of another. That connective tissue highway is very liquid. And the immune system runs through a lot of those pathways and channels. We think about it a lot as being the lymph system, but it's also this entire fluid highway that runs through the whole body.
Yeah, a couple of things that are really interesting here. So you see how the capillaries are in there, and you've got the fat cells in there. So think about what this means in terms of those collagen fibers. The movement of those collagen fibers are going to affect these capillaries. They're going to affect circulation. Nerves are going to run through these matrix, right? So it's going to nerves. That's a lot of the way the nerves are going to communicate is by the movement of these collagen fibers. And I always find the fat cells really interesting there, because remember, as much as we all hate to admit to this, fat cells have unlimited capacity to fill. And if you can imagine how those fat cells, how they would fill and how they can push away the collagen fibers and affect the continuity of those collagen fibers. So what's really nice about this little, what you see here is this little cube that almost looks like, a Jell-O dessert, if you will. It really is full of a lot of information on how closely bound all of these cells and these fibers are to each other and how they relate to each other. And the fascia creates that relationship.
And to Joy's point about the fat cells, like you think about cellulite, right?
None of us want to think about
right,
cellulite.
We don't want to think about it, I know, but basically that is the fat cells taking up space. I really wish you could see my hands. Taking up space within this collagen matrix and pushing into that collagen matrix and deforming it. If you think about somebody who has lost a lot of weight and how their skin has that sort of saggy quality, that's also because the fat cells have pushed out the collagen and changed the structure of the tissue so that when those fat cells go away, it's like you pulled the stuffing out of an animal, yeah? Okay, I want to go to one more slide, and then we're going to talk a little bit in person. So here, these are just all the different components of fascia. So there's fibroblasts and mast cells, and these produce both the fibers and also a lot of the immune components that are in the fascia. There's fibers, as I talked about. So collagen, reticulin, and elastane, all of which provide structure and create different kinds of fascia, depending on whether it needs to be very stiff or very loose. There's a lot of chemicals in here, a whole bunch more than I've listed there. Any of you who are into, health, facial care, hyaluronic acid may be something familiar to you. It's a major lubricant in the whole body. It creates, a nice plump facial cells and all those kinds of things. Then there's this very critical thing called glycosaminoglycans, which is also called GAGs, and is essentially mucus. So this is basically the snot that runs between all of your tissues to allow them to slide over each other, glide around each other, and create the movement that we experience. And much like the rest of the body, a whole bunch of this comes down to water. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and do a couple of other things here.
Okay, no, so there's spotlights.
Yeah, I'm gonna find this. Where are we?
Hold on one second, guys. Ah, technology.
I know. Oh,
There we are.
Okay.
Okay,
All
so
right.
you should all be seeing us now.
Right. So a couple of things. I like to use visuals for this.
Which visual would you like, Nora? In case I came in and Nora was like already doing the whole set for us.
So the first thing I want to start with, we're going to talk through different kinds of fascia.
Wait, before you start with that,
okay,
can I just say one thing?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know. You guys are all international. I don't know if you know the show Stranger Things, and it's a sci-fi. And this thought came to me while I was watching it as this human being basically imploded and became like mush on the ground, right? Much like this ball that has no structure, right? It has fluidity. It's got some jelly-like substance to it. And it made me realize that without our connective tissue, without our bones, without our ligaments, without our tendons, without our muscles, without all of those fibers, this would be us on the ground, right? So what we're talking about, what Nora's going to build up now for you, is she's going to build us up, right? From that little sci-fi blob on the floor to a living, breathing, moving, independent structure. Okay, sorry, I get very excited.
So this is a little bit of cotton batting. And the reason I have this is because this is my model of loose connective tissue. Okay, and loose connective tissue is what goes between the skin layer and then the deeper connective tissue layer, which is much thicker and stiffer, that goes around our muscles. Okay, so you see how this is very open and loose. This is where little fat cells can go in there and start to distort it. But you notice how the fibers are all sort of chaotically organized? That's exactly how fascia organizes itself. And it organizes itself in such a way that you have the mobility that you want. Does that make sense? So
that's so profound. So what you're saying is there's logic in chaos.
There is logic in chaos, and chaos responds to logic. It responds to the movement that we make.
Yeah.
So
boy, that's profound for today. Yeah.
So for example, if I keep pulling this way, right? Let's say I've got a movement that's going to continually, like with my bicep, continually stress the tissues in this direction, right? I'm not so much stressing them in this direction. Then I'm going to get more fibers that support that movement, right? Now, if on the other hand, let's say I was in a cast for 6 weeks or whatever, because I had a broken arm or something. They don't do that as much as they used to. Then when I come out of that cast, that fascial tissue may have changed its shape. So it no longer has the mobility that it needs to have to stretch in the way that I'm used to. If any of you have been immobilized, even for a short period of time, you recognize that. Even if you just sit for too long in your chair and you stand up and go, oh, you know, your hip flexors have gotten short, your hips have gotten short. All of that is, again, well, that's not fascial remodeling at that point. That's more the fluid, the glycosaminoglycans in it. But basically, we do remodel, and our body responds exactly to what we do to it. The more we do, the more movement we have, the more activity our body will respond to. We really do train our body from our brain all the way through our neuromyofascial web. And what we do is reflected deeply in our structure.
The chaotic fractal nature of the connective tissue is really important because we are not inanimate objects, right? We're an inanimate object. You can put one brick on top of the other to support, right? So the bottom brick is supporting the top brick. We need, Nora was talking about the bicep. Well, the bicep can move, right? Your shoulder moves in all directions. Your bicep is working with that shoulder. It needs to be reactive to stresses and tension in all directions. So how does the body do that? Well, it doesn't just lay down parallel fibers. It lays down fibers in all directions so that regardless of what you're doing, you have strength at a particular range because tension is going to come into the system and it's going to trigger, oh, I need the bicep to be strong at a particular range. So there is logic in the chaos, and it needs that chaos in order to be able to support the dynamic nature of our human movement.
And one little piece here is fascia does remodel, but it takes a long time. So they say 6 months to 18 months to really remodel fascia and to have it respond to whatever new movement pattern you're putting into it. Now, for a lot of us that, a lot of you guys, particularly who keep moving all the time, you don't have those deficits. But I think about some of my clients who are, for example, super forward head, and they've been like this for the last 30 years because they're a lawyer. It may take some time for the tissues literally to allow their head to come back up on their body. So yes, it will remodel, it takes time. And remodeling through movement is slower than remodeling through manual therapy, right? A good rolfer can go in and adjust the structure or change the structure a little more quickly than we can as movers. As movers, we have a slow but effective way to change things. One more thing, so that's our loose connective tissue. And that really goes again between our skin and this deeper layer. Now, this is my next little crazy toy here. So here is essentially like the deeper layer. And the deeper layer, my little thing sits right on top of it. This is my skin. This is my superficial fascia, or my loose connective tissue. And now look at this as more of a sheet, right? And this is our dense connective tissue. This is that silver skin. If you've taken apart a chicken recently or anything, that silver skin is more tendons, but if you that coating around the muscle, that's what this is. And this doesn't have any fibers on it. You can see that it's just plain. These fibers would again have fibers that run through it that reflect the movement patterns of that body. Joy and I did a dissection course a couple of years ago now. And what was really interesting was you take off the skin and you see these fascial layers. And you also see, like, for example, in the rib cage, you see that on one side of the rib cage, the fibers are running at one angle, the top layer of fibers. On the other side of the rib cage, they're running at a slightly different angle, right? Because most of us are not symmetrical. Maybe that person was a carpenter or was a golfer. So the fascia, again, is going to grow and build in the direction that you train it in. So here, if we have our deep connective tissue, now you'll notice I have this is slightly connected. So hopefully you can kind of see that these layers slide over each other. Okay, so between these layers, there's another bit of loosish connective tissue. This isn't true all over the body, but many parts of the body. And that's what allows our muscles to glide around each other. Now remember that inside all of this is a sponge. No, not really. So is water. And so what happens here is basically when our tissues are full of water, right? They're kind of full. And then as we squeeze, as we pump the blood out of it, we squeeze the water out. Here we're going to pull the water in, and then we squeeze the water out. So movement moves water through the body, and that's something we're going to talk about again in a minute. So let me go back to the PowerPoint for a second, because I think there's some things on there that you will like to see. I have to unpin myself. Play glasses back on. Oh, I just go back. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to go back to my share screen. Okay, so we talked about the components. We've talked a bit about what it does. So what I'd like to do now is talk through, oh, I can go through that one. We love this image, so we wanted to bring that image up there. So fascia.
Yeah, so listen, yeah. These are all the things that, right, that it does. It surrounds, it penetrates the structure of the body. It creates structure. I think we all get that. It transfers force. Nora started talking about allowing glide between muscles. We're going to talk to you guys. It also helps us provide proprioception and nociception. Like, how do we experience ourselves? How do we experience pain? And it serves as a pathway for nutrition, cellular nutrition, our immune system, hydration, healing, and recovery. But we really like this image. So take a look at this image. And if you can imagine, right, this is fascia. Even it could be around a cell, it could be around a structure. But look at how her right leg and the tension of the right leg up into that fabric needs the anchoring of the left leg to make that fascial structure taut. That's giving information. So the movement of the right leg informs the left leg, and the anchoring of the left leg informs the right. And then everything that's going to be inside of that, right? Nerves, it could be muscles, it could be nerves, it could be circulation, are going to be flowing in the direction of whatever the movement of those legs are going to do. This is the relationship of fascia internally to us. And if you can see for her, it goes all the way around through her arms. So she pushes out through her arms, and that's going to feed back all the way up and through the trunk, into the core and through the legs, right? So she's completely enwrapped, encased, and connected here. And this is a nice symbol for our human movement and how fascia transmits information through human movement.
Now, this next slide is really a summary. This is like the heart of the matter, if you will. So we're going to talk through this a bit in terms of moving fascia. These are the concepts that are most interesting, I think, to us as movers about how fascia works. So I talked already about the warm-up, and this is what they call a gel-sol transformation. So something moves from a gel state to a soluble state or a solventy state. Mm-hmm. And this happens, it's also called gag liquefaction. Great name, I have to say. Wow. So this is where heat is critical. And again, that idea that you're stiff in the morning, or you show up at class and you haven't done much that day and you're kind of creaky and cranky. A lot of that is because that layer, do you remember that water we were just talking about in between those layers, has gotten a little thick, a little viscous, and is decreasing the smooth glide of the muscles around that.
Right, of all the structures around.
Of all the structures around that, right. Everything.
Right.
So one thing I take from this very simply is, one of the challenges I have with Pilates is if you just start lying on your back with tiny movements, you're not going to warm up the body. You know, the 100 was designed to warm up the body. And I think there's other ways to do that, and you might want to think about that. But really, you want to get the blood flowing. I like to get the blood flowing, and you need to get the blood flowing to have the maximum benefit from your movement.
Crazy thought. Why don't we go back to the first slide? They can all in their own homes get up with us and move.
All right.
And do a little warm up. I think we should move.
All right, you guys, everybody stand up. We can see some of you.
We're going to move your gags.
Yes. And actually, I'm going to just do this. I'm going to do this just from, not with that on. So I'm going to share for the moment, and we'll just go through this.
Since you've got it so that we can stand, we might as well do it.
Exactly. Okay.
All right. So everybody stand up, right? So that you get up in the morning and you put your feet on the floor, or maybe not you, but your clients will say, "Oh, my feet, my ankles, my back is stiff." This is just a lot of that mucus, that viscous, right? The fluid getting very viscous-like. And so, as Nora was saying, if we start with really small movements, we're not really affecting that change, right? This is the beauty of whole body integration of movement. So Nora put together this nice little warm up, and I think it's great. And I think we might as well just all move. Everybody get up. I know, Pam, it's 3 in the morning, but get up.
So for wherever you are, and I can't see you, so do as you like. But basically, you have to get the big muscles moving to create heat. If the big muscles aren't moving, if I'm doing this with my hand, that's kind of warming up my hand. But what I really need to do is get a little bit of the heart pumping, get a little bit of the big muscles, getting some blood going through them, because that's what will actually give yourself that gel-sol liquefaction transformation thing. Yeah? So if it's comfortable, I like to start with just a little bit of a squat, just something that's, kind of big and easy. I'm lubricating here, my hip joint, my knee joints, my ankle joints, even my shoulders getting a little bit of something. And I'm using the big muscles, my big muscles on my thighs, primarily to get some blood going, to use some energy, and then to create that idea that, oh, okay, I'm getting a little bit warm. And hopefully for you too, you feel like your knees are getting a little bit more easy, your ankles maybe are stopping creaking, and things are starting to move up, yeah? Now let's just take the arms up. You always know this, I always do this one. And coming back down. Now let's take that with the knee bend and just come back up and down. Breathing with it. So now we're adding the upper body to this, yeah? We're getting the scapula to slide across the rib cage in the back. You're using, as soon as you use the upper body, your heart rate tends to go up. So you're getting a little more blood circulation just from doing that. Now, we've just worked on a couple of specific planes. I now want to take this a little differently. So let's take a moment and just roll the shoulders around. Okay, so here again, I'm making the scapula move around the rib cage. So I'm giving it a nice, again, lubrication quality. Eric Franklin often talks about the sponging quality. That basically, it's like I've got a little sponge on the inside of my scapula, and I'm scrubbing the back of my rib cage with it. Yeah, so I've just lubricated that whole system to get it nice and warm. And then let's do the same thing with the torso. So now I'm going to go into internal rotation, getting the glenohumeral joint going, and work on thoracic flexion and extension. So here I've warmed things up a bit. Now I'm taking movement, but I'm still keeping it fairly dynamic. And you can find a breath pattern. I can't breathe and talk at the same time, so Joy can breathe for us all. Yeah? Now, the one thing that is really important in terms of warming up the joints is also looking at rotation. We do a lot of things in the sagittal plane. That's kind of where we live in terms of walking and running. But rotation is oftentimes where you get some of those different angles of the fascia going. You get some glide going in some different planes. And you also have the ability to, for example, stimulate the intervertebral discs and the spine and the joints in ways that they don't always get stimulated. Remember that everything responds to what we do to it. So come on down, bend your knees a little bit. And we're going to start with just a nice, easy rotation. Yeah, again, most of you have seen this warm up from me. So here, notice what's happening in your legs. Right? Notice that you're getting some stresses on your knees that you don't get when you're walking or running or staying sagittal. Yeah? And this allows some of those fascial connections, as Joy was talking about, to be created so that your body can comfortably take those other pathways, those other unexpected movement patterns that we have, yeah? And coming up into the torso, getting that nice and loose and lubricated. All right, so that's kind of a general warm-up. We've got some big muscles going, we've got some nice rotation, we've done some rotation through our upper body. Now, another thing that I like to do is just taking the hips. So the hips are a particularly funky area for many of us, and especially for your clients. You know, they often say with arthritis, for example, that the reason you get arthritis it can be from overuse, but it can also be from underuse. That if you don't move those joints in every way you can, that you'll lose some of the mobility in those joints. So basically, the bones or the tissues will not be prepared for, you know, a sudden step to the side or, you know, jumping when you have to avoid tripping over your dog or your child. So keeping those going. Same thing with the knees, taking that little circling of the knees. Again, unlike in fitness land, we're often really keeping those legs straight ahead. But in regular land, in the world, your knee might be in any number of strange places if you're actually, say, running after a ball or running after your 2-year-old. So all of those situations, you want to get and train all those angles to have that different flow. Now, the other thing that we were working on with that was, we'll come back here. Thank you guys, is we have glide. So one of the other things we're working on with all this is gliding the tissues over each other. So getting the lubrication going, warming things up, and creating glide.
Anybody got questions? You can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Anyone?
All right.
Okay, we'll carry on.
All right.
So,
you know, this is interesting. I remember first practicing, and I spent a lot of time lying supine on a trap table breathing.
Yeah, me too.
And I just even now, just a little bit, right? And you know, you all have your warm-ups, you all have your different ways in which you're doing things. But if I were to lie down and breathe now, I would have greater access to my breath because of a lot of the rotation, especially the standing rotational stuff that we did. because you're really starting to work the elasticity right through. And when we talk about the gags, you all have clients who are very stiff in their lower backs, really getting the movement through the spine. And it's starting to warm that up, and then moving into our breathing, moving into footwork, moving in. Then you start to see, we may even get better results.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, some of this too is, especially as people age, right? Collagen changes. The gags change their structure. Any of you who are getting older like I am, it's like, oh my.
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Gravity, it's not our friend. But really at that point, things get drier. They just literally do. This is why my understanding in Japan, and Mara, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they often call frozen shoulder middle-aged woman's shoulder, because that's when it happens, because that lubrication dries up, and that's what creates the stickiness in adhesive capsulitis or frozen shoulder, for example. All right, so that's a little bit of that glide piece. Now I want to go back to that slide we had and go through our next little summary here. Bear with me. Here we go. All right, so the next piece that we talked about was this fascial glide. And this is where, again, when the muscles move, so let's say my bicep is moving, or my arm, I'm flexing my elbow anyway, right? Now, there are a lot of different muscles that do that. My biceps is sort of superficial, but my brachialis is underneath that. Coracobrachialis is the side of that. And then I've got all of my forearm flexors that come up and attach around the elbow joint. One of the things about fascial glide is that if, let's say, for example, I scar something, you've had a surgery or you broke something somewhere along the way, and there is a lack of continuity in those tissues. What happens with scarring, yeah, exactly. So Joy is being, work it, yeah.
I don't know if you guys can see this, right? But Nora's got this really nice mesh on, and if I pull on the mesh, maybe you need to put us bigger again.
Okay.
Hold on, we're gonna try something.
Hang on a second, we're playing with something here. Looking at fascial glide. Okay.
All right, so actually let's imagine that Nora's jacket is the fascial covering of the muscle and the tissues underneath. So as she bends and straightens her elbow, right, it's gliding underneath. Now, what's gonna happen is I'm gonna put a little tension on there. You see the tension, and then she's gonna bend, and that tension's gonna release, and there's gonna be tension and release. And depending on the pull, the fabric will move and put tension in different directions. Now, Nora was talking about a scar. What happens if there's a scar? Well, this pull here in my left hand does not transfer the force to my right hand. It stops. Its energy gets stopped at the level of the scar. Okay? So now, in that case where we've got whatever structure we have underneath there, if that, we lost.
Okay, I'm viewing somebody else's something.
Hold on a second,
that's
we have
lovely,
technical
Katerina,
difficulties.
but I'm trying to get us back here. Okay.
There we go.
All right. I'm not sure what happened there. Did we lose everybody? Hope not. Not sure what's going on here.
Go to Zoom. Hold on a second, guys. We're definitely.
Somebody shared their screen. I think it's Katerina.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're back. You guys can see us. Yeah, Portia?
I'm still seeing Katerina. So, oh, there you are. Okay. There we go.
Thank you.
All right.
It's a beautiful shot.
That was Hawaii shot.
So anyway, so if there's a scar, right? So I'm going to put tension here, and Nora's going to pull, and there's a scar. That scar, while you see it on the surface, can be deep to the structures underneath it. And that's going to not only affect the impact, the forces going from my left hand to my right, but deep into the structure. So that's going to affect the way the structure then is able to facilitate or figure out the information that's coming in through the various tensioning of the system, right? So this is part of what Nora was talking about. Sorry. Go for it. Now tossing it back.
So the idea of fascial glide, and one of the things that I like to say about fascial glide is one of the real benefits that I think we offer as Pilates teachers is that we tend to move people in a whole lot of different ways. You know, I think of a lot of what I see in regular fitness land. They have a relatively limited, not all of them, but they can have a relatively limited movement vocabulary. In Pilates, we have a fairly extensive movement vocabulary. And most of you, because I know most of you, have expanded that even beyond the regular Pilates vocabulary, right? To really include this angle and this angle and that angle and this angle with resistance coming from all different directions. And that really helps the glide to train the glide and to make that glide more accessible. It helps to pattern free movement around the joints. Really, really important. So that's fascial glide, yeah?
And don't think about it as a one muscle system, right? Nora raises her arm all the way, Nora, all the way. She's tensioning, right? She's tensioning this through her front and through her back. So that arm movement is tensioning all the way through the torso. So don't think about this fascial glide as a one-to-one ratio. This is part of this scaffolding that pulls the body together.
And this is where we get on to kind of our next concept, which is, we've talked about this different ways, and honestly, we're still working on this one, but it's force transmission. So force transmission, what does she mean by that? Let me take a moment here and talk a little bit about that. I'm assuming some of you are familiar with Thomas Myers. He's certainly been out there for a long time. So I'm going to assume some of you have heard his name before, seen the Anatomy Trains book, yeah, and all the different ways that he connects the different trains of myofascial tissue across the body. So for force transmission, and we know this from a million different, we know this in everyday life all the time. In order for me, for example, I'm looking at Artemis right now, who's a tennis player. For me to deliver force to the end of my tennis racket, that force has to come from lower down in the body. It has to transfer, ideally, from my feet and the ground forces through my torso or through my legs, through my pelvis, through my torso, to the shoulder. And really, when they do biomechanical studies of how much force is going through all the different joints, only about 10% comes from the arm. The rest of it comes from that force generated below that is basically like a wave. You think of a stadium wave, right? And ends up at that tennis racket. So this is where Joy's point about scarring breaks up that force transmission pathway, right? So just like this, if I've got a scar here, then this force is only going to go to here, and it may not get this part of the muscle involved. It'll make me weaker. It'll make it much less comfortable, might lose range of motion, those kind of things. One other thought about force transmission is that, again, because it's easiest for Western science to break things up, we do that really well. We're often taught, this is the muscle, it does these three things. This is this muscle, it does these three things. It turns out, when they look at how much force a particular muscle can generate, a whole bunch of that force gets transferred to the muscles around it.
Right, and we'll definitely explore that as its own entity. But it's really a significant amount of the muscle power is not just directed to the muscle, but it's transmitted to the muscles and the structures around it. And that was a huge concept in understanding the relationship of movement, right? So it's really, if we're looking at changing dynamic movement patterns, just an isolated bicep curl is not going to achieve that, right? Okay. Ooh, there were so many good things that you said that I was, okay, never mind. I'm going to try not to distract us.
No, she may come back. So this is again where, to our benefit, Pilates does this all the time. And we are constantly looking at force transmission in different planes with different resistance coming from different angles. You think about, just very simply, you think about taking standing arm work at the end of the trap table, right? I'm standing facing away from the trap table and I'm, I've got my little straps right here and I'm doing a little push or I'm leaning into it. Okay, that force moving through that entire anterior body. not just the shoulder, but into the torso and through the hips, etc. I turn around and I pull. And now all that force is going more through the back body and changing its angle. I go to the side and I pull, or I add a rotation. What we do really trains not just the fascial glide, but also the force transmission to be graceful and continuous through the structure.
I actually think that's one of our strengths. We can have this conversation, and I really can't wait for the next time we're all sitting around the table at a POT, just chatting about this kind of stuff. But I do think that this is our strength in Pilates.
Yeah,
is that we don't necessarily overload with tremendous amounts of force,
right.
But what we do is we dynamically move through force. So we encourage glide at end ranges of motion. And then we also have to control the return against a spring, which is providing this weird kind of, unstable, if you will, tension. That's part of what is built into the system, and it is unique and is really uniquely suited for training glide and sensitivity to tension in the body.
Yeah, and joint action. Right, it's through
that. That's a joy action.
There's always that. But that's really where you understand that because we move the joints in so many different angles, right? It stimulates the joints, but also stimulates all the muscles to work better. And we often talk about Pilates as being foundation training. We're not necessarily strength training in the sense of being able to lift 400 pounds over my head. We're not necessarily just flexibility training. But we train foundational movement patterns of all the joints to work together in harmony. And that's an incredibly powerful thing that we do. And something we hope to keep doing.
Yeah. Let's go back to that slide, Nora, because listen, you guys now at this point, in movement principles, we talk about training protocols for like the shoulders and the hips. This slide that Nora's got up is really a nice training protocol when you're thinking about fascia specific training. Right? Warm things up, get things moving. Then, work on establishing glide. And then add force or tension into the system using the springs, right? Using various positions in relationship to gravity. So this slide of these moving fascia concepts really create a nice training protocol when you're thinking about working and training from a fascial perspective. And it really will start to change your eye, especially when you start looking at fascial glide. I mean, you guys sitting there, start to play with just your wrists and your hands and look at your forearms and look at how the skin will rotate and how the muscles and the tendons will pop up at certain times and how those muscles underneath there really need to have they need to glide on one another because they're tight inside that forearm and they're packed in there. And if they don't glide on one another, you're going to lose the dexterity and the feeling and the mobility of the fingertips and the wrist. So anyway, going back to these fascial concepts, these are really nice. This is sort of nice hierarchy to have in your mind when you start playing with this stuff.
So the next piece, that's force transmission. And again, this is a very quick overview of these things. But the next thing is elastic recoil. And I want to talk this through really from the beginning because this whole concept so far is based on, as far as I know, one study in rats. So who knows if this really happens in humans, but it does seem to happen in humans. So this is the study. They did a study where they took little tiny rats and they, who were just wandering around doing their usual rat thing, weren't doing a lot of jumping.
Turn it back to you so you can.
I'm sorry. Okay,
talk
I'm going to talk through this and make my hands make funny shapes. Okay.
Nora's hands make lots of funny shapes, so you might as well see them.
So basically, right, rats. And what they did was they took a tiny little piece of the rat's Achilles tendon, and they looked at the structure of the fascia in the Achilles tendon from a rat that was pretty much just wandering about doing rat-like things. And what they discovered was, in a rat that was just wandering about, their collagen, their ligament, their tendon structure was fairly chaotic. It was just kind of smushy like this. And this doesn't allow force to transfer well through it. Okay, can you see that this isn't really, that's not going to get my force. It'll allow a lot of glide, but it's not necessarily going to be a good surface for force to go through, because force is going to get lost in the smudginess. Does that make sense? And then what they did was, and this just is sort of hilarious, then they found a way to get rats to do a lot of jumping. So they had to jump to push a little lever and then food would come out. So they trained rats to jump, which just is funny anyway. And then they took, again, another little sample of the rat tendon. And what they discovered, what they saw was that the tendon structure changed quite radically from the chaos of this to a much more structured pattern like this. So can you see how this is going to really transfer force efficiently, right? It's not going to get all smishy and go up. This is not going to transfer force efficiently, right? Force is going to get dispersed by the sogginess, if you will, of that tissue structure. So what they discovered from this was that jumping or other ballistic motions, when done with correct timing, restructure the tendons so that they will store more elastic energy.
Say that again about storing energy.
Okay.
Okay.
So this is one of those weird concepts that still is slightly fuzzy, but there we go. So in other words, if I, let's say, pull this to its maximum, it will spring back, right? It's like if you pull something very stiff, like a spring, you pull it really stiff, you let it go, it's going to come back really fast. That was the tendon structure that changed in these rats, that instead of being this kind of squashy felt-like structure, then when that rat goes to jump, that tensions the pattern. And then when they release, that little release actually sends energy through the system and allows them to jump higher.
All right, so that's great. So Maushami, am I reading this right? The concept of force transmission in chains of muscles facilitates energy transfer, such as what we see in PNF patterns. So here's the deal. Your tendons store the energy. When that is released, it's like taking a rubber band, right? And or a slingshot, and you're cocking it, right? You're filling it with potential energy. And when it's released, that energy is transferred through the muscle. That muscle, if it's just found or bound in one muscle, is going to exhaust. So what does that muscle do? It transfers it through the fascial chain to the muscles surrounding it, which is what's going to give you, boom, the power in jumping. So or running. So when you look at a runner, and a runner has that beautiful sort of almost lightness to, they're not, I'm a plotter, boom, I hit the ground and I sink, I absorb energy. Nora, she's got springy. She's a little springier. She's much more springier than I am. So she's got a lot more of that elastic recoil in this case, mostly in her Achilles, and it's going to send energy out through her legs, and it's going to give her more strength. I don't want to say strength, but it's going to really give her more spring, and it's also usually going to give you more endurance, right? Because the muscles will not fatigue as quickly, right? Does that make sense? So if you don't have that, right? If you don't have that, what ends up happening is you're plodding, your muscles are trying really hard to do the work for you, and they're not transferring their energy and getting any help from the surrounding structures. And that's a lot of what we're talking about.
And one of the things too, like this, again, they just talked about rat tendons, but when you think about it, other elements that support this idea are things like a baseball pitcher. They say like a baseball pitcher, who's really good, can throw a ball at 90 miles an hour, whatever they do. They're literally, the muscles and the nervous system cannot respond fast enough to create the reaction through the whole chain that will let that ball go 90 miles an hour. So what happens with that is that, again, if I'm taking a rotational move and then I'm throwing it, that is also a windup of the fascial tissue. So the tissue gets tensioned, and then the release of that tension, if it's timed correctly, creates power through that whole system.
Right. And Lisa, thank you for the word. The word is power, right? And that's what gives the sort of that recoil, that response, and the ability to transfer force is what is going to result in power. Yeah.
Right. And this is all about timing. It's literally all about timing. So I was just playing back here. So if I'm just jumping, and I'm letting myself stop. If I stop, I lose all benefit of that elastic recoil.
Right. It diffuses.
It just vanishes. On the other hand, if I find a timing where I can keep going, and I'm really like, as soon as I land, I jump up again, that allows that elastic recoil to happen, yeah, and to work. So again, it's true here, but it's also true for power sports in the upper body. One of the things, Joy, would you stand up for a minute?
Oh, okay.
I know. Okay.
Yes. What are we doing?
We're gonna do a little bit of this.
All right.
So, right, we can do our nice little standing. This is our little partner.
You guys could do little push-ups against something.
We're gonna like basically push off from each other. Now, I have seen a little bit of issues with this because our hands are not really a source of elastic recoil necessarily, right? Our feet are.
Yeah.
Our hands aren't so much.
They're really fine motor.
Yeah, exactly. They got really a different purpose in life. But here is an interesting way to create a little bit of that spring. And I don't know about you, Joy, but this is easier. Because of that spring, it's like it makes it like, whee! And it actually decreases energy usage.
Try that against the wall, guys. Try that against the wall.
Yeah, or if you've got somebody there, you can actually touch it this time.
All right, so we are at 10:54. And what's happening is, what usually happens is we're now getting really excited. So,
so I think I just want to open it up to questions at this point and see if there's any questions or comments coming through.
yes, more.
Yeah, okay, cool. And again, we want to do these in just little bites. I think we'll be back.
Yeah, so
Next
listen,
Friday?
so this is
Yeah.
just sort of an introduction into fascial training and where this goes, right? So we didn't even start talking about what it looks like inside of, we started talking about what it looks like inside our environment. But I do want to give you one last thought, something for you to contemplate, especially in these weird days, which is, as we talk about fascia, nothing changes without a little tension, right? So you need to tension the system. The tension in is going to respond. The body is going to respond. It's going to the feedback. Oh, everybody's unmuting. As we talk about even today, what I like to think is the amount of tension that we're all under today externally, it's going to actually lead to a tremendous amount of change on the back end of this. And a lot of it is my hope is going to be really positive and good change. But physically, remember, nothing changes internally without a little tension.
We have recorded this. That's one of the questions, and we'll post this up for you guys to take a look at. Again, as we said, this is truly just the beginning of everything. I want to go to, yeah, hang on a second. Portia's got her hand raised. All right, Portia. Oh, thank you. Sorry, she's clapping.
You're clapping.
She's doing a reaction. What I'd like to do now for a moment is go to gallery view. There's a lot of you on the call, but go to gallery view.
Look at you guys. Or we're in gallery view, so put it on gallery view so you can see each other.
Yeah. Look at all of us. It's amazing. You're all so cool. So if anybody has a specific question, we'd be happy to answer it. Anybody have any questions?
I do.
Okay, hop on.
Hi, everyone. It's Erica Quest here. Nora and Joy, I was curious if there was any further information on the concept of remodeling associated with scarification of tissue. Like if there's a surgery or an injury where there's a scar of any size.
There's a ton of information on that. One of the things that the fascial researchers are really interested in is what happens to the body with manual therapy, right? That's a lot of who has driven this. And so they're very interested in what happens with scarring and how to essentially, typically through manual work, because it's way less efficient to do it through movement. It takes way longer and doesn't always work. But manual therapy can often, if you think about like you're trying to create a web that goes this way, in a scar, you get this, right? And it blocks the flow through because the fibers are not running in the proper direction. Good manual therapy will typically, ideally break up some of those cross fibers that are not allowing the tissues to go in the right direction. And that combined with movement training can help to straighten things out.
I was going to say, really, a lot of the literature for movement is combining it with manual therapy.
Right.
So manual therapy gets the sort of immediate response, and the movement therapy can really, training can really help that remodel over time.
Yeah, and I'm happy to send some resources. There's a lot of information on that out there. If you just look at, manual therapy, scar tissue work, you'll get a lot of information on that. There's a lot out there.
Okay, look like a little pea head on Florida.
Anybody else? Marina? All right. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a shared thought, but it's because of people who have been operated to their backs, and they have really big changes in the whole muscles and tissue, and they're eager to recover, and they're thinking they're going to be well in a year or so. Mm-hmm. And I'm not seeing that at all. So it's taking much longer, and we have to take them at ease with that and say, well, all the movements are going to be different. So one of
the things that we didn't get to in this hour that we maybe will cover next time is something called the thoracolumbar fascia, which is essentially this, profound organizational system with the lower back as its center. So if you think about this system that crosses from one side of the back to the other on a diagonal, and there's a lot of other angles there too, when you disrupt that transmission through the spine and through the lower spine especially, you really create tremendous trouble because that is a key factor of every single movement that we do, is that transmission across the thoracolumbar fascia. One more thing, in back surgeries, what I've found in my experience is it's not just the fascial scarring. It's oftentimes that scarring goes down to the bone level and decreases, say, the facet joint movement and other things at the joint level as well. So in that circumstance, I would certainly recommend, as I always do, manual therapy to kind of get in there and see if they can break up whatever's happening, at least on the surface layer or the surface and the muscle layer, along with movement. If they just do movement, it can take forever, really.
If you've ever played anything like three-dimensional chess, scarring, what you see on the outside, we think of as the scar. It's actually three-dimensional, and especially now think about your women who have had C-sections, and how they report really not having sensation in the lower abdominal area, or sometimes having tightness, pulling. So
Tessa's raising her hand. She has a newborn.
So that scar that you see across the abdomen is three-dimensional deep into the abdominal cavity. And how that three-dimensional scar heals greatly impacts movement quality and ability and muscle and force transmission through the muscles, and especially the lower abdominal region. This is now, so this today was broad strokes. And what Nora and I are thinking of doing, and you guys are going to tell us yes or no, we're thinking now of diving in specific to some of these, giving you a little more specifics, and going into our world and talking about, scarring, for example, thoracolumbar fascia, for example, and just start talking more specifics. Is that a good thought? Yeah, thumbs up. Okay,
cool. All right, very good. All right, my friends, thank you very much for joining us. Once again, we will send out, as we've been doing you're getting a lot of emails from us lately, the PowerPoint, a link to the recording. And again, if you have any questions, we're here. Yeah. Just like you, we're hanging around waiting for you to call. Actually, that's not exactly true. Right. I sound like my Jewish mother-in-law there, but that's okay.
Right, and then we're gonna take this, and we'll send you information. We'll start taking a deeper dive.
Yeah. We're doing thoracolumbar fascia next week?
Yeah, let's do thoracolumbar fascia next week, yes. Yeah,
because that really brings a lot of these concepts together, from glide, through force transmission, through scarring, and relates directly to low back pain, which, so many people have. So we also have a cool prop that I was not able to get together, but I think for next week, we'll have a cool prop that hopefully will make that clear.
Okay.
All right, my friends, we love you. Be well.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday. Everybody unmute yourself.
Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday, dear Portia. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
Love you guys. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're a ring of fire, man.
That's right.
Ring of fire.